I'm sitting in my car outside the biggest house I've ever seen in my life. It's November 3rd, 2022. I'm 28 years old, wearing a dress I bought on credit, and I'm 43 minutes late to meet the man who might decide whether I get to marry the person I love. My hands are shaking on the steering wheel. My makeup is smudged, and I smell like coffee and rain and something else I can't quite place. Something that reminds me of bus stations and cardboard and desperation. I should explain how I got here. Not just to this driveway, this mansion, this moment, but how I got here to this life, this choice, this test I'm about to fail. Have you ever done something kind without thinking, and then spent the rest of the day wondering if that kindness just cost you everything? Share your story in the comments below. My name is Ava Chen. I'm a second-grade teacher in Portland, Oregon. I make $43,000 a year before taxes. I live in a studio apartment in Southeast Portland that costs more than it should and smells like the Thai restaurant downstairs. I drive a 2004 Honda Civic with 180,000 miles and a check engine light that's been on for 2 years. I am, by every measurable standard, completely ordinary, except for one thing. I'm engaged to marry James Whitmore. James is the most extraordinary person I've ever met, and not because of his family, though we'll get to that. James is extraordinary because he's kind in a world that doesn't reward kindness. Because he listens when people talk. Because he remembers the names of every student I've ever mentioned, asks about them months later. Wants to know if Marcus finally learned his times tables or if Sophie stopped hiding during recess. We met 2 years ago at a bookstore. Powell's, the big one downtown, the one that takes up an entire city block. I was looking for picture books for my classroom. He was looking for poetry. We both reached for the same book at the same time, an illustrated edition of Mary Oliver poems. Our hands touched. We both apologized. We both laughed. And then we spent 3 hours talking in the cafe upstairs about teaching and poetry and what it means to live a meaningful life. He told me he worked in sustainable agriculture, helping small farms transition to organic practices. He told me he'd grown up in rural Oregon, understood hard work, believed in it. He told me his family was complicated, but aren't all families complicated? He didn't tell me his father was Richard Whitmore. Richard Whitmore. If you don't recognize the name, you're lucky. He's a venture capitalist, one of those men who made billions in the tech boom of the 90s and then spent the next 3 decades making more billions in timber, and real estate and anything else that could be bought cheap and sold high. He's famously private, famously difficult, and famously estranged from most of his children. James is the youngest of 5. 3 of his siblings don't speak to their father anymore. The 4th lives in New Zealand and hasn't been home in a decade. James is the only one who still tries, the only one who calls every Sunday, who sends birthday cards, who refuses to give up on the idea that his father might, someday, decide to be human again. I didn't know any of this when I fell in love with James. He told me 6 months into our relationship, after he proposed, after I'd said yes. After we'd started planning a small wedding in my parents' backyard in Eugene. There's something you should know, he said. We were in my apartment, sitting on my secondhand couch, eating takeout pad thai. About my family. About my father. He told me everything. The money, the isolation. The way Richard Whitmore had built an empire by being ruthless and strategic and completely unwilling to trust anyone. The way he'd tested his children their entire lives, setting up elaborate scenarios to see if they were loyal, if they were worthy, if they were weak. He thinks everyone wants something from him, James said quietly. And he's usually right. So he pushes people away before they can disappoint him. Does he know about me? I asked. Yes. I told him I was engaged. He wants to meet you. The way James said it, the heaviness in his voice, I knew this wasn't just a casual dinner. This was an audition, a test. The kind of test Richard Whitmore was famous for. What if he doesn't approve? I asked. James took my hand. Then we get married anyway. I don't need his permission. But Ava, I need you to understand something. If you meet him, if you walk into that house, he's going to test you. He won't tell you he's testing you, but he will be. He always does. And I can't tell you what the test will be because I never know. But whatever happens, just be yourself. That's all I want, just be you. So here we are. November 3rd, 2022. The meeting was scheduled for 1 p.m. at Richard Whitmore's estate in the Columbia River Gorge, about 45 minutes outside Portland. A house I've never seen. In a location James wouldn't tell me until this morning because Dad doesn't like people knowing where he lives. I left my apartment at 11 a.m., giving myself 2 hours for a 45-minute drive because I'm the kind of person who arrives early to everything. I'm the teacher who's in her classroom at 6:30 a.m. Even though school doesn't start until 8 o'clock, I am the friend who shows up to dinner 15 minutes early and waits in the car. Being late makes me physically anxious, like my skin is too tight. The drive out of Portland was beautiful. November in Oregon means rain, but today was one of those rare clear days, cold and bright. The kind of light that makes everything look sharper. I drove east on I-84, following the Columbia River, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to forests to the massive cliffs and waterfalls of the gorge. I'd made myself lunch that morning. A turkey sandwich on wheat bread, an apple, a bag of chips. I don't usually eat before stressful events, but James had insisted. "You need to eat," he'd said. "Dad likes to do long dinners. You'll need your strength." So the sandwich was in a paper bag on the passenger seat, next to my purse and a folder of information James had given me about his father. Background, interests, topics to avoid. I'd studied it like I was preparing for a final exam. Richard Whitmore, 74 years old. Born in rural Idaho, worked his way through college, made his first million by age 30 in software development. Married once, divorced after 20 years. 5 children, most of them estranged. Hobbies: collecting rare books, fly fishing, Beethoven. Topics to avoid: his ex-wife, politics, asking for money or favors. I was still 40 minutes from the estate when I saw him. He was standing at a bus stop on the side of Highway 14, on the Washington side of the river. There's a bridge at Cascade Blocks that crosses the Columbia, and I'd taken it because James's directions had me approaching from the north. The bus stop was one of those rural ones, just a sign and a bench, no shelter. Exposed to the wind that whips through the gorge like the river is breathing. He was an old man, maybe 70, wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather, no hat, no gloves. He was sitting on the bench with his shoulders hunched, hands shoved in his pockets, looking down at the ground. There was a plastic grocery bag beside him. The kind people use to carry everything they own when they have nowhere else to put it. I drove past him. Looked in my rearview mirror. Kept driving. I don't usually stop. I know that sounds terrible, but it's true. I'm a single woman. I'm small. I've been told my whole life not to pick up strangers. My mother's voice in my head. "You can't save everyone, Ava, you can't fix the world." But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the way he was sitting, like he'd given up. Maybe it was the clear cold day and the knowledge that buses in rural Washington run maybe twice a day. Maybe it was the fact that I was on my way to meet a billionaire and this man was sitting alone in the wind with everything he owned in a plastic bag. I pulled over about 100 yards past the bus stop. Sat there for a moment, arguing with myself. I was going to be late. I was going to smell like car exhaust and stress. James had said to be on time, to make a good first impression, to not do anything that would give his father an excuse to judge me. But I couldn't leave him there. I put the car in reverse, backed up, pulled into the gravel turnout beside the bus stop. Got out. The cold hit me immediately. That particular gorge wind that cuts through everything. The man looked up when he heard my car door. His face was weathered, deeply lined, the kind of face that's seen decades of sun and cold and hardship. His eyes were blue, pale and watery. He didn't smile. "Excuse me," I said, walking toward him. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you waiting for the bus?" He nodded once, cautious. "Can I give you a ride somewhere?" "I'm heading east, toward Hood River. I could drop you wherever you're going." He studied me for a long moment. I could see him making calculations, deciding if I was dangerous, if this was a trick, if he could trust me. "I'm going to Hood River," he said finally. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "Trying to get to the shelter before dark." "I can take you," I said. "It's on my way." He stood slowly, picked up his plastic bag. He was tall, maybe 6'2", but stooped, like the weight of his life had compressed his spine. He smelled like unwashed clothes and wood smoke and something medicinal, sharp, and chemical. We walked to my car together. He got in the passenger seat carefully, moving the paper bag with my lunch to the floor. He didn't put on his seatbelt. Just sat there, hands in his lap, looking straight ahead. I got in, started the car, pulled back onto the highway. We drove in silence for maybe 5 minutes. The radio was off. The only sound was the engine and the wind and the occasional semi-truck passing us going the other direction. "Thank you," he said suddenly. "For stopping. Of course, most people don't." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "I'm not dangerous," he added, like he needed me to know. "I know I look it, but I'm not. I'm just old and cold and trying to get somewhere warm." "I didn't think you were dangerous," I lied. Because I had thought it for a split second, and I felt ashamed of thinking it. More silence. Then, "You got somewhere important to be?" "You look dressed up." I glanced down at my dress, suddenly self-conscious. It was navy blue conservative, the kind of thing you wear to a job interview or a funeral. I'd spent an hour deciding what to wear, Googling what to wear to meet your rich future father-in-law, finding nothing helpful. "I'm meeting someone," I said. "Someone important." "I'm actually running a little behind. I can get out if you need to hurry," he said immediately. "I don't want to make you late." "No, it's fine, really." But it wasn't fine. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. 12:37. I was supposed to arrive at 1 o'clock. According to the GPS, I was still 23 minutes away. I was going to be late. Not terribly late, but late enough that Richard Whitmore would notice, would wonder, would add it to whatever mental file he was building about me. We drove through the town of Cascade Locks, past the bridge, heading east along the river. The scenery was stunning, the kind of beauty Oregon is famous for, but I barely saw it. I was thinking about time, about first impressions, about tests I didn't understand. "You hungry?" I asked suddenly. The old man turned to look at me. "What?" "I have a sandwich. I made it this morning, but I'm too nervous to eat. You want it?" I could see him wanting to say no, pride warring with hunger. Hunger won. "If you're not going to eat it," he said carefully. I reached down, grabbed the paper bag from the floor, handed it to him. He opened it slowly, like it might disappear if he moved too fast. Pulled out the sandwich, unwrapped it from the plastic wrap I'd folded around it. He ate it in 4 bites. Didn't say anything. Just ate methodically, like eating was work he had to finish. Then he pulled out the apple, the chips, looked at me. "Go ahead," I said. "Really. I want you to have it." He ate everything. When he was done, he carefully folded the paper bag, held it in his lap like it had value. "Thank you," he said. His voice was different now, softer. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. I was going to wait till the shelter, but..." He stopped. "Thank you." "You're welcome." We pulled into Hood River 20 minutes later. 12:58. I was officially going to be late. The shelter was on the west end of town, an old church building with a sign out front. I pulled into the parking lot, stopped near the entrance. The old man opened his door, started to get out, then paused. He turned back to me. "That person you're meeting," he said. "The important one. They're lucky to know you." "I don't know about that," I said, trying to smile. "I do." He looked at me with those pale blue eyes. "Most people would have driven past. You stopped. You shared your food. You made yourself late for something important to help someone who can't help you back. That's rare. Don't let anybody make you feel like it's not." And then he was gone, walking toward the shelter, disappearing inside. I sat there for a moment, feeling something shift in my chest. Then I looked at the clock. 1:01, I was late. I programmed the address James had given me into my GPS, 15 minutes away up a private road into the hills above Hood River. I drove fast, probably too fast, through the wealthy neighborhoods where houses have gates and names instead of numbers. The Whitmore estate was at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by pine trees, invisible from the road. The house itself was massive, all glass and wood and modern architecture. The kind of place that appears in magazines about sustainable luxury. There were 3 cars in the circular driveway. A Tesla, a Range Rover, and a vintage Mercedes. My Honda Civic looked like it had wandered in from a different universe. I parked, checked my makeup in the rearview mirror. My mascara had smudged a little. I fixed it with a finger, took a breath, got out. The front door opened before I could knock. James was there, looking worried and relieved and handsome in a button-down shirt and dark jeans. "You made it," he said, hugging me quickly. I was starting to worry. "I'm sorry I'm late. I stopped. How did I explain?" "I'll tell you later." "It's okay. He's in the dining room. Are you ready?" "No." "Yes." James took my hand, led me through an entryway that was bigger than my entire apartment, down a hallway lined with what looked like original artwork, into a formal dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gorge. There was a long table set for 3. And at the head of that table, sitting in a chair like it was a throne, was the old man from the bus stop. I stopped walking. James kept moving, pulling me gently forward. "Dad, this is Ava. Ava, this is my father, Richard Whitmore." The old man, Richard Whitmore, stood up. He wasn't stooped anymore. He was tall, straight-backed, commanding. He was wearing different clothes now, expensive ones, dark slacks and a crisp white shirt. His face was the same, weathered and lined, but his eyes were different. Sharp. Assessing. He was watching me. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't speak. Could barely stand. This was the test. This was always the test. The homeless man at the bus stop was Richard Whitmore, one of the richest men in Oregon, and I'd picked him up and given him my lunch and made myself late, and now he knew exactly what kind of person I was. "Please," Richard said, gesturing to a chair. His voice was the same, rough and gravelly, but there was authority in it now. "Sit." I sat. James sat beside me, looking between us, confused. He didn't understand yet what had happened. "Ava," Richard said, sitting back down. "Thank you for joining us. I understand you had an interesting drive." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Mr. Whitmore, did you stop for anything on your way?" He interrupted. "Any delays?" I looked at James. He was frowning now, starting to understand something was wrong. I looked back at Richard. His face was unreadable. I could lie. I could say traffic, bad GPS, anything. He'd given me an out. He'd set up the test and now he was giving me a chance to fail it or pass it, depending on what he wanted. But I couldn't lie. Not to him, not to James, not to myself. "Yes," I said. I stopped to pick up a man at a bus stop. He was cold and hungry and I had a sandwich I wasn't going to eat, so I gave it to him. And I drove him to the shelter in Hood River. "That's why I'm late. And I understand if you think that's..." I stopped, throat tight. "I'm sorry I was late." Silence. James was staring at his father now, and I could see understanding dawning on his face. "Dad," James said slowly. "What did you do?" Richard didn't look at his son. He was still watching me, those pale blue eyes seeing everything, missing nothing. "I wanted to know who you were," Richard said to me. "Not who you pretend to be. Who you are when you think nobody's watching, when there's no benefit to being kind, when it costs you something." "That's not fair," James said, anger creeping into his voice. "You can't just..." "James," Richard said quietly. "Let me finish." James fell silent, but I could feel his hand find mine under the table. Squeeze it. Richard leaned back in his chair. "I've spent my entire life building things, protecting things, trying to figure out who I can trust. I've been lied to by business partners, by friends, by family. People see money and they see opportunity, and I've learned to recognize that look in their eyes. That calculation. That hunger." He paused. "I didn't see it in you. Not when you stopped. Not when you offered me a ride. Not when you gave me your lunch. You were nervous, yes. Worried about being late. But you stopped anyway. And when I tried to get out of the car so you wouldn't be late, you told me to stay. You chose kindness over convenience. That's rare." I couldn't speak. Couldn't do anything but sit there and listen. My son tells me you're a teacher, Richard continued. That you work with children, that you make very little money, that you live in a small apartment and drive an old car and spend your own salary on books and supplies for students whose parents can't afford them. He tells me you're the kindest person he's ever met. I wanted to know if that was true. It's true, James said fiercely. I can see that now. Richard looked at me for a long moment. Ava, I don't trust easily. I've seen too much, lost too much, been betrayed too many times. I raised 5 children and watched 4 of them grow to resent me, to want my money but not me. James is the only one who still calls, who still tries. And I've spent years wondering what I did wrong, how I failed them. And the answer is simple. I tested them. Constantly. Relentlessly. And they all failed because I designed the test to be impossible to pass. He stopped. Took a breath. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. But you passed. You weren't supposed to pass. I was standing at that bus stop thinking nobody would stop. And if they did, they'd make an excuse and leave quickly. But you stayed. You shared what you had. You made yourself late for the most important meeting of your life to help someone you thought was nobody. He wasn't nobody, I said softly. He was a person who needed help. Yes, Richard said. He was. And you saw that. Not everyone does. James squeezed my hand tighter. Richard stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the gorge. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone outside my lawyers. I was homeless once. For 6 months when I was 19. My father kicked me out for dropping out of college to start a business. He said I was throwing my life away. He said if I wanted to be a failure, I could do it without his support. So I lived in my car for a while, then in a shelter, then on the street, and I learned something during those 6 months. I learned who people really are when they think you're worthless. He turned back to us. Most people looked through me. Like I was invisible. A few were cruel. But a handful, a very small handful, were kind. And those people saved my life. Not with money or jobs or opportunities, with sandwiches, with rides. With small moments of human decency that reminded me I was still human. I felt tears building behind my eyes. I made a promise to myself, Richard continued, that if I ever made something of my life, I'd remember those people. I'd be like them. But somewhere along the way I forgot. I got rich and suspicious and paranoid, and I forgot what it felt like to be invisible. So every few years I go back. I stand at that bus stop or one like it, and I wait to see who stops. Most years, nobody does. But today, you did. He came back to the table, sat down. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. This wasn't just a test to see if you're good enough for my son. This was a test to see if I'm good enough for you. Because James deserves better than what I've given him. He deserves a family that chooses kindness. And you're that family. Dad, James said. His voice was thick. I'm sorry, Richard said to him. For the years I wasted being afraid. For the tests and the suspicion and the walls I built. You were right to keep trying. You were right not to give up on me. And Ava, I'm sorry for deceiving you today. But I'm not sorry I met you the way I did. Because now I know. I know my son is marrying someone who stops at bus stops. Someone who shares sandwiches. Someone who makes herself late to help people who can't help her back. And that's all I needed to know. I was crying now silently, tears running down my face. So, here's what I want to tell you both, Richard said. Get married. Have the wedding in Eugene, in your parents' backyard, exactly like you planned. I'll be there if you'll have me. And after, I'd like to be part of your lives. Not as the patriarch who controls everything, but as James's father, as your family. If you'll give me that chance. James was crying too now. Of course, he managed to say. Richard looked at me. Ava? Of course, he managed to say. Richard looked at me. Ava, he managed to say. I wiped my face, tried to speak, couldn't find words. So I stood up, walked around the table and hugged him. This man I'd met twice in one day, once as a stranger and once as family. He hugged me back. This tall, stooped man who'd pretended to be homeless to test my character, who'd learned kindness from strangers and forgotten it and remembered it again. Thank you, I whispered. For stopping at that bus stop. For letting me help you. Thank you, he whispered back. For stopping. We had lunch after that. Real lunch. Brought out by a private chef I hadn't noticed hiding in the kitchen. We talked for 3 hours. Not about tests or money or the past, but about the future. About the wedding, about teaching, about James's work with farms and Richard's collection of rare books and my students and their endless questions. It was the longest meal I'd ever had, and the easiest. When James and I finally left, driving back down that gravel driveway in my old Honda, I was exhausted and relieved and still a little stunned. I can't believe he did that, James said. I can't believe he actually stood at a bus stop pretending to be homeless. It worked, I said. What do you mean? He found out who I was, and I found out who he was. We both passed the test. James was quiet for a moment. Then, I love you. I loved you before today. But I love you even more now. Because I stopped? Because you couldn't not stop. That's who you are. We got married 4 months later, in March, in my parents' backyard in Eugene. It rained, of course, because this is Oregon and rain is what we do. But nobody cared. Richard was there, in the front row, crying openly when James and I said our vows. My students came, 23 second graders in their church clothes, throwing rose petals and giggling. My parents were there, looking stunned that their daughter was marrying into wealth, but mostly just happy that I was happy. Richard gave a toast at the reception. Short, simple, heartfelt. He talked about kindness, about second chances, about how the best things in life are the ones you don't see coming. I thought I'd lost my family, he said. But it turns out I just needed to stand at a bus stop and wait for someone to stop. That was 2 years ago, November 2024 now. James and I live in a house in Southeast Portland, bigger than my old apartment, but nothing extravagant. We're still teachers, both of us, though James has taken over his father's foundation, using the Whitmore money to fund small farms and food security programs. Richard comes to dinner once a month. Always on the first Sunday. He's teaching me to fly fish. I'm terrible at it, but he's patient, more patient than I expected. He's rebuilding relationships with his other children, slowly, carefully. Some of them are willing to try, some aren't. He doesn't blame them. He still goes to that bus stop sometimes. Not to test people, but to remember. To stand there and feel what it felt like to be invisible, to be cold, to wonder if anyone would stop. And then he donates to shelters, to food banks, to programs that help people who are standing at their own bus stops, waiting. Last month, he told me something. We were sitting on my back porch, drinking coffee, watching James plant tomatoes in the garden. I've changed my will, he said quietly. I'm leaving most of my money to charity. Food programs, shelters, literacy programs. But I'm setting aside a trust for you and James, not for you to live on. For you to give away. I want you to use it to help teachers, to buy school supplies, to make sure kids like your students have books and food and people who believe in them. Richard, you don't have to. I know. But I want to. Because you stopped at a bus stop. Because you shared a sandwich. Because you reminded me what matters. I cried. I cry a lot around Richard Whitmore. Besides, he added, smiling slightly, I figure it just the least I can do for the woman who saved my son's life. I didn't save his life. Yes, you did. He was drowning in my family's dysfunction, in my failures as a father. And you pulled him out. You showed him what love looks like when it's not transactional. When it's not a test. We sat there in silence for a while, drinking coffee, watching James work in the garden, listening to the city wake up around us. Can I tell you something? I said finally. Of course. I almost didn't stop. I drove right past you. I had to turn around. He nodded. I know. I saw you hesitate. What if I hadn't turned around? He thought about that. I don't know. Maybe I would have stood there all day. Maybe nobody else would have stopped. Maybe I would have gone home thinking I was right, that people can't be trusted, that kindness is dead. And I would have missed out on knowing you. On knowing that James found someone who makes him better. On getting a second chance at being a father. So you're saying my turning around changed everything. I'm saying kindness always changes everything. Even when we don't see it. especially when we don't see it. So, let me ask you something, because I think about this all the time now. I think about that moment when I drove past the bus stop, when I could have kept going, when I almost did. What would you have done? Would you have stopped? And if you did stop, if you gave something you needed to someone you didn't know, would you have regretted it when it made you late? When it cost you something, when nobody was watching to see your choice? I'm asking because I think we all stand at bus stops sometimes. We all have moments where we can turn around or keep driving, where we can share what we have or hold it close, where we can help or hurry past. And I'm asking because those moments matter, not because someone might be testing us, but because we're testing ourselves. Because the person we are when nobody's watching is the person we really are. Richard Whitmore was testing me that day, but I was testing myself too. And I passed not because I'm particularly good or noble or special, but because in that moment, I chose to be the person I wanted to be. That's all any of us can do. Choose in the small moments, in the bus stops and the sandwiches and the times we're running late, to be kind. To stop, to turn around. Because you never know who's watching. And you never know what small act of kindness might change everything. Share your story in the comments. Tell me about a time you stopped, or didn't stop, or wished you had. Tell me about the bus stops in your life, the moments where you had to choose. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that small choices have big consequences, hit that subscribe button, because the world needs more stories like this. Stories that prove kindness isn't weakness, that stopping isn't losing, that the best things in life are the ones we don't see coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And the next time you see someone standing at a bus stop, cold and alone and waiting, I hope you remember this story. I hope you stop. Clauda uma ia e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.